Welcome back to ABA Chapter Chat. I'm so excited for today because we're diving into something that's both visually engaging and super practical: graphing in performance management.
It's one of those things we use constantly in ABA, but there's always something new to learn about how to really make those graphs work for us.
Right. Okay, so let's start with the basics. We hear terms like baseline, intervention, and goal all the time. Can you break those down? Like, imagine you're talking to someone totally new to ABA.
Okay, so think of baseline as that initial data we get. Before we put any intervention into place, it basically gives us a picture of what the behavior looks like naturally without any influence.
Got it. So then we introduce the intervention, which is whatever strategy or technique we're using to try and change that behavior.
Exactly. And then our goal is that desired outcome, where we want the behavior to end up.
So the graph basically becomes the visual representation of that whole journey, from baseline to intervention and hopefully to that goal.
Yeah, and the cool thing about a graph is that it doesn't just show us those isolated points. It connects them. And then it reveals trends and patterns that you might not see if you were just looking at a table of numbers.
You know, it's funny. When I first started in ABA, I was so focused on just collecting all that data that I'd kind of forget to graph it. I'd have all these pages of numbers, and it wasn't until I actually took the time to put them on a graph that things really clicked for me.
It's kind of like trying to understand a story by looking at a jumbled list of words. That's what it's like to analyze data without a graph. And figure 8.1 in our source material is a perfect example. If you just glance at the table, you might miss some details. But when you see those same data points on a graph, the trends jump out at you.
Totally. It's like the difference between reading a recipe and watching someone bake a cake.
Yeah.
You know, the recipe gives you all the ingredients and the steps, but actually seeing it all come together visually gives you a much deeper understanding.
And just like a good baker carefully measures out each ingredient, it's so important for us to construct our graphs in a way that accurately reflects the data. And a mistake that some people make is using averages for their baseline data.
Oh, why would that be a problem, though? Isn't the average supposed to give you a good overall picture of the data?
Well, it can be misleading because averages can actually smooth out some of the variations in the data, especially if the behavior we're looking at is pretty variable. Figure 8.3 in our source material shows how an average baseline can mask an increasing trend. So say we're looking at a child's tantrums. The average might look stable, but the graph shows that they're actually becoming more frequent.
Oh, that makes sense. We wouldn't want to miss those subtle changes, would we? So when we're setting up a graph, what are the key things we need to include to make sure it's accurate and also easy to understand?
Well, first we need clear labels, just like a map tells you what each symbol represents. The graph needs to clearly show what's being measured on each axis. Then we plot our baseline data, those pre-intervention data points. That's our starting point.
Like setting the stage.
Yeah. And then we mark our intervention points, which is when we started implementing the new strategy. And that visually separates the baseline from the intervention phase. And then finally, and this is so important, we draw our goal line to represent that desired level of behavior.
So we have a clear target to aim for. But what about sharing these graphs? Are there any ethical considerations we need to think about when it comes to displaying data like this?
Absolutely. This is where we need to be really careful and think about who has access to this information. Individual graphs, those should always be kept private, you know? We have to protect our clients' confidentiality.
Right. But what about group graphs, the ones that show data from multiple people? Could those be displayed publicly?
Yes. Group graphs can be displayed publicly,
Yeah.
and they can be really great for fostering teamwork and positive reinforcement.
I can see how that would work. Seeing everyone's progress as a team could be really motivating. But when it comes to individual graphs, it's super important to prioritize privacy.
Exactly. And even with group graphs, we want to be mindful of how that data is presented. Make sure it's easy to understand and avoid any potential misinterpretations.
So let's talk about making those public-facing graphs really effective. What are your thoughts on what makes a graph stand out and really grab people's attention?
Well, first and foremost, it has to be easy to read. We don't want people struggling to figure out what the graph is showing.
Keep it simple? Got it.
What else? It needs to be easy to see. So make it large enough. Bold lines, clear labels. Think billboard, not sticky note.
Size matters. I'm picturing a giant, colorful graph that just draws people in.
Exactly. We want them to be attractive. Think about how advertising works. Bright colors, eye-catching graphics, even a catchy title. Get creative with colors and fonts that make the data pop.
I love it. So we've got this giant, colorful, easy-to-read graph. Where do we put it to make sure it gets the most attention?
Well, think high-traffic areas, where employees will naturally see it throughout the day. Break rooms, hallways, near the time clocks.
Got it. front and center. Spark some conversations. Encourage some positive reinforcement. Now, I have a question. Can a graph actually change behavior all on its own? Or is it more about the consequences and the reinforcement that we provide?
That's a great question. And it brings us to a common misconception. The myth of the magic graph. Graphs are powerful tools, but they're not magic wands. They're not going to automatically change behavior. It's tempting to think that just by putting up a graph will magically change behavior, but like our source material points out, the graph didn't work is something we hear way too often.
Right. So just creating a beautiful graph and expecting everyone to fall in line isn't really enough, is it? There's more to it.
Exactly. Remember, consequences are what drive behavior change. A graph can show us the impact of those consequences, but the reinforcement we provide is what makes a difference.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like thinking that a fitness tracker alone will make you lose weight. It's the exercise and the healthy eating that get you there.
Perfect analogy. The graph is like a fitness tracker. It gives you useful information, but it's the actions we take based on that information that matter.
So speaking of taking action, how can we use graphs to actually reinforce behavior?
Well, graphs can be super helpful for guiding our reinforcement strategies. By analyzing the data, we can see what's working, identify trends, and adjust our approach.
So it's like a feedback loop, helping us fine-tune our interventions.
Exactly. But here's a really important point. We should never reinforce solely based on graph trends. We need to observe the actual behavior as well to make sure we're reinforcing the right things.
Oh, I see how that could be easy to forget. We get so caught up in the numbers that we forget we're working with real people with complex behaviors.
And sometimes those numbers can be misleading too. Like an upward trend on a graph doesn't always mean that the individual is actually putting in more effort. It could be a change in the system or some other outside factor.
So we have to be able to tell the difference between human performance and system performance. That's important.
Absolutely. And it highlights why we need to be careful about reinforcing based only on what we see on a graph. We need to make sure we're reinforcing the person's behavior, not just a change in the system.
You know, this reminds me of a time when I was working with a team on increasing productivity. I got so excited by this upward trend on the graph. I started handing out rewards like crazy.
Sounds familiar. What happened?
Well, it turns out the productivity increase was actually because of a new piece of equipment that had been installed. Not because the team was working harder or anything. It was a good lesson learned for me. Always look beyond the graph and see what's really going on.
Yeah. That's a great example of how relying only on the graph data can lead us down the wrong path. It's a reminder that graphs are tools to help us make decisions. They're not the ones calling the shots.
So how do we strike that balance then? Using graphs effectively without falling into that magic graph trap. I think a lot of people struggle with that.
I think it comes down to using graphs as a guide, not like a rule book. They can help us spot patterns, see trends, track progress, but we always need to combine that with what we're seeing in real life.
So it's really a partnership between data analysis and observation. We need both.
Exactly. And that's where our skills as ABA professionals come in. We're trained to look beyond the numbers and understand how behavior really works.
And that understanding lets us use graphs the right way, ethically, making sure they're truly helping us create positive change. So as we wrap up our deep dive into graphing and performance management, let's go over some of the main things we learned today. All right, let's do a recap. What were some of those big takeaways about graphing?
Well, we talked about how powerful graphs are for seeing those behavior patterns and for really understanding if our interventions are working. They make trends and variability and the impact of our strategies so much clearer than just trying to decipher a table.
Right. And we can't forget about all those essential elements that every good graph needs. Clear labels, baseline data intervention points, and of course that goal line. They're like the foundation of our data story.
And speaking of stories, that one about using averages for baseline data was a good reminder that we got to look at the whole picture, right? Averages can sometimes hide important variations, and we don't want to miss those.
Definitely. We also touched on those ethical considerations with displaying data, especially when it comes to those individual graphs versus the group graphs. Privacy is super important, and we got to be cautious about how we're handling and sharing that sensitive information.
Couldn't agree more. But those group graphs can be a fantastic way to encourage teamwork and celebrate successes, especially when they're big, bold, colorful, and put up where everyone will see them.
Make them pop. But I think the biggest takeaway for me, and maybe for a lot of our listeners, is debunking that whole magic graph myth. It's so easy to think that just putting up a graph will magically fix everything.
Graphs are great tools. But they're not magic wands. They're more like compasses, guiding us toward those effective interventions. But it's our expertise, our ability to observe behavior in the real world, and our thoughtful use of reinforcement that really creates those lasting changes.
So true. It's about that combination of data analysis and real-world observation.
Right.
We need both to make the best decisions for the people we're working with.
Exactly, and that's what makes this field so interesting. It's not just about the numbers, it's about understanding the people behind the data.
Well said. This deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like I have a whole new appreciation for how powerful graphing can be in ABA. Any final thoughts for our listeners today?
I'd say this, use the power of visuals, but don't let the graph completely control everything you do. Combine those data insights with your observations, your clinical judgment, and your empathy for your clients, and you'll be on the right track to make a real difference.
What a great way to wrap things up. To everyone listening out there, how can you use these graphing techniques to make your data analysis and interventions even better? Think about your clients, the goals you're working towards, and how showing the data visually can get you there.
And don't forget to share your experiences and ask any questions you might have on our ABA Chapter Chat social media. We love hearing from you and continuing the conversation.
That's right, we're all learning and growing together as ABA professionals. And make sure to tune in next time for another exciting topic in the world of ABA. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and keep those graphs coming.